You know what's happening to you. That's the strange part. That's what makes this particular kind of suffering so disorienting. You're not in the dark. You've done the reading. You've done the work. You understand your patterns. You can name your attachment style. You know where the anxiety comes from. You can trace the self-criticism back to its origin. You know which relationships trigger which wounds and why. And you still suffer. Not the way someone suffers who has no idea what's going on. Not the innocent, confused suffering of someone encountering their patterns for the first time. The other kind. The more complicated kind. The kind where you can see exactly what's happening. You can almost narrate it in real time. And it happens anyway. You recognize the dynamic as it's unfolding. You know the thought isn't accurate. You understand that the fear is old, that it belongs to a different situation, a different time, a different version of you, and you feel it anyway, at full intensity, like the understanding does nothing. If you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you've been there, you've probably also asked yourself the question that nobody in the self-awareness space ever quite answers, honestly. Why isn't the understanding enough? Here's the thing most personal development content gets wrong. It implies, sometimes directly, mostly indirectly, that understanding is the solution. That if you can just see clearly enough, name it clearly enough, understand it clearly enough, the suffering will reduce, will eventually stop. The model goes, ignorance causes suffering, awareness reduces it, more awareness reduces it more. And if you're still suffering despite your self-awareness, that means you need more of it. More insight, more processing, more understanding of deeper and deeper layers. That model is wrong, or at least it's incomplete in ways that matter. Understanding is necessary. I'm not arguing against it. The person with zero self-awareness is genuinely in a harder position than the person who can see their patterns. Understanding opens up possibilities that didn't exist before. But understanding is not the mechanism of change. It's the beginning of the possibility of change. And confusing those two things, thinking that understanding something is the same as changing it, is one of the most common and most frustrating mistakes that emotionally intelligent people make. Let me give you a specific example. Someone who grew up with a parent who was emotionally unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes critical, sometimes loving, in ways that didn't have an obvious pattern the child could predict or control. That child's nervous system learned something, not consciously, just through repetition and survival. It learned to stay hyper-alert, to constantly scan the environment for signals about which version of the parent was present today, to interpret small cues as big threats or small reassurances. It learned that love was uncertain, that connection required constant monitoring, that the gap between someone being there and someone pulling away was something that happened without warning and needed to be managed. That learning didn't stay in childhood. It moved with the person into adulthood, into every relationship. Now that person is 35 or 45. They've been in therapy. They understand completely where the hypervigilance comes from. They can explain the neuroscience if you ask them. They know that when their partner is quiet for a few hours, it's not an emergency, that it probably means their partner is just tired. They know all of this. And when their partner goes quiet, their nervous system activates anyway. The scanning starts, the checking, the slight but persistent sense that something is wrong and needs to be addressed. The understanding did not prevent the activation. It runs alongside it, observing, explaining, annotating. But the body does what the body was trained to do. This is the key thing that most self-awareness conversations miss. The body is not educated by understanding. The nervous system doesn't learn from insight. It learns from experience. These are not the same thing. When you understand something intellectually, the information lives in the cortex, the thinking part, the part that's capable of language and narrative and the kind of processing you do in therapy or journaling or when you're reading something like this. But the patterns that produce most of our suffering, the anxiety, the defensive reactions, the hypervigilance, the shutting down, the cycles in relationships, those don't live in the cortex. They live much lower, in the parts of the nervous system that were online long before you had language. That learned through direct experience, not through explanation. And that part of the system is not impressed by your insights. It doesn't know you've been to therapy. It doesn't update its responses based on what you've understood. It responds to what the environment is doing right now and compares it to the patterns it learned earlier, much earlier, and activates accordingly. The gap between what you know and how you respond isn't a failure of understanding. It's a gap between two different systems, two different kinds of learning, two different parts of what it means to be a human animal. This is the part of the self-awareness conversation that doesn't get said enough. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of honesty. So what does the body actually learn from? Not from insight, from experience, specifically from new experience. Experience that's different from the old pattern. Experience that provides the nervous system with evidence, real, repeated, felt evidence, that the old response is no longer the appropriate one. The person with the hypervigilant nervous system doesn't change by understanding hypervigilance better. They change by having repeated experiences where they activate, stay present, and discover that the feared thing doesn't happen. Where the partner goes quiet and the hypervigilance fires, and they stay with the discomfort instead of immediately trying to resolve it, and the partner comes back. Is fine, was just tired. That experience repeated enough times starts to update something, not because they understood it, because they lived it. Because the body accumulated evidence that contradicted the old learning. This is slow. It's not linear. It doesn't feel like progress in any obvious way. There's no clear moment where you can say, there, that's when the pattern changed. But it does change. Through the accumulation of different experiences, through the nervous system gradually, imperfectly, learning something new by living something new. Understanding makes this possible. It makes it more intentional. When you understand what's happening, you can make choices about how to respond to it rather than simply being swept along by it. You can decide to stay instead of flee, to feel instead of numb, to be present to the experience instead of managing it from a distance. But the understanding is not what does the work. The experience is. Here's another thing that emotionally intelligent people do that keeps them suffering. They use self-awareness as a buffer. This sounds strange, so let me explain. Self-awareness is supposed to be about getting closer to yourself, about seeing more clearly, about being more present to your own experience. But it can flip. And when it flips, self-awareness becomes a way of staying at a safe distance from your own experience, of observing it rather than being in it, of narrating it rather than feeling it. You've probably felt this. The moment where something difficult is happening, a painful emotion, a triggering situation, a conversation that's activating something old, and instead of being in the feeling, you step slightly to the side of it. You become the observer, the analyst, the person who understands what's happening. And from that position, you're technically more aware than someone who has no idea what's going on. You can name it, trace it, contextualize it, but you're not actually feeling it. Not fully, not in the complete, unmediated bodily way that feelings need to be felt in order to move through and clear. You're experiencing the understanding of the feeling, not the feeling itself. And feelings that are understood but not felt don't resolve. They don't metabolize. They stay, waiting for the moment when they're finally allowed to be what they are, without immediately being converted into content for analysis. This is one of the more painful ironies available to emotionally intelligent people. The very skill they've developed, the capacity to observe and understand their inner life, can become the primary mechanism by which they avoid actually inhabiting it. Let me say something about the difference between processing and feeling. Processing is what therapy, journaling, and most self-awareness practices are designed to facilitate. You take an experience, you examine it, you understand its context and its origins, you make sense of it in relation to your history. This is valuable. It genuinely helps. Unprocessed experiences accumulate and cause problems. Processing gives them form, narrative, context. But processing is not the same as feeling. And emotional intelligence in the culture has become very much about processing. Feeling, the actual, direct, bodily, unmediated experience of an emotion, is different. It doesn't require understanding. It doesn't require narrative. It requires presence and tolerance. The willingness to let the grief be grief without immediately explaining it. To let the anger be anger without instantly contextualizing it. To let the fear be fear without racing to understand its origins. Most emotionally intelligent people are very good at processing. They're often much less practiced at the simpler and harder thing of just feeling, just letting it be there, without analyzing it, without understanding it, without turning it into information. Just being present to the actual experience of it, in the body, in the moment, without management. That's different from self-awareness, and it's often more important. Here's something that might be difficult to hear. Sometimes the reason emotionally intelligent people still suffer isn't because they haven't understood enough. It's because the suffering is pointing at something that understanding can't fix. There are losses that need to be grieved, not understood. There are wounds that need to be felt, not processed. There are changes that need to be made in the actual life, the real external life, the relationships, the work, the daily existence, not just in the relationship to inner experience. Self-awareness is extraordinarily good at illuminating what's happening inside you. It's much less useful at telling you what to do about it in the world. Sometimes the pattern that keeps repeating isn't a neurological habit to be rewired. It's a completely appropriate response to an actual ongoing situation that needs to change. Sometimes the anxiety isn't old material being triggered. It's a clear signal that something in the current life is genuinely wrong and needs to be addressed. Sometimes the grief isn't unresolved historical material. It's a real current loss that deserves to be mourned for what it actually is, not analyzed for what it represents. Self-awareness doesn't always tell you the difference, and the risk for emotionally intelligent people is that they turn every genuine signal into material for inner work, when sometimes the right response to a signal is external action, not more understanding. A different job, a different relationship, a different living situation, an honest conversation that has been avoided for years. These are not primarily inner work problems, they're life problems, and insight, however deep, doesn't solve life problems. Choices do. There's something I want to say about relationships specifically, because a lot of the suffering that emotionally intelligent people experience happens in close relationships, and the self-awareness that they've developed is often applied extensively to their own side of the dynamic, to understanding their reactions, their triggers, their patterns. What gets less examined is the dynamic itself. You can understand exactly why your nervous system responds the way it does in a relationship, and still be in a relationship that is genuinely not good for you. The understanding of your response doesn't change what's producing it. There's a version of emotional intelligence that can become a tool for self-blame, where everything that's difficult in a relationship gets converted into something you need to work on, your triggers, your patterns, your defenses, and sometimes that's right. Sometimes the relationship is fine and your reactions are the thing that needs attention. But sometimes the relationship isn't fine, and using self-awareness to constantly examine your own contribution to the difficulty can become a way of not seeing or not admitting that the situation itself is the problem. Real emotional intelligence includes the capacity to look at a relationship and say, this isn't working. Not just, I have work to do here, but this particular dynamic with this particular person is not something that can be fixed by more self-awareness on my part. That takes a different kind of courage than insight, the courage of an external conclusion rather than an internal one. Here's what I want to say about the people who are highest on the self-awareness spectrum. The ones who have done the most work, the most therapy, the most reading, the most reflection, who can articulate their interior with exceptional clarity and sophistication. These people often suffer in a specific and rarely discussed way. They feel like they should be further along, like given how much they understand, given how much work they've done. They shouldn't still be struggling with the things they're still struggling with. The relationship patterns that keep appearing, the anxiety that keeps coming back, the self-criticism that persists despite years of work on it. And that gap between how much they understand and how much has actually changed produces a secondary suffering that can be worse than the original. The judgment of themselves for not being further along, the confusion about what they're doing wrong, the quiet despair of doing everything right and still not arriving. I want to be direct about this. You're not doing it wrong. The gap between understanding and healing is not evidence of failure. It's evidence of how these things actually work, of the difference between cognitive learning and the deeper, slower, more experiential kind of change that the body actually requires. The person who has done 10 years of therapy and still has anxiety is not 10 years behind. They are, in many ways, 10 years ahead of where they would have been without it. The work changed things, even when it's hard to see exactly how. But understanding is not resolution, and waiting to resolve before you live, waiting to be finished with the work before you actually inhabit your life fully, that's its own form of suffering. You can do the inner work and live your life at the same time. You don't have to be finished to be present. Let me talk about what actually helps, not instead of self-awareness. Alongside it, beyond it. The first thing is moving from observation to participation in your own experience. The next time something difficult is happening inside you, the next time a pattern activates, the next time an old feeling surfaces, try being in it rather than watching it, not immediately naming it, not immediately understanding where it comes from, just being present to what it actually feels like in the body, the physical sensation of it, where it lives, what it feels like, how it moves or doesn't move. This is harder than it sounds, particularly if you've trained yourself to observe your interior. The observing is fast, automatic, comfortable. Being present to the actual experience without immediately converting it to content, that takes deliberate effort. But it's where more of the actual change happens, in the presence, in the full experience of the thing, not in the understanding of it. The second thing is the willingness to take external action on the signals your self-awareness is generating. If your anxiety is pointing at something real in your current life, address the thing. Don't just understand the anxiety, do something about what it's pointing at. If your patterns in relationships are showing you something about the kind of relationships you keep choosing, change the choices, not just understand why you make them. If the inner work has been generating insight for years without corresponding changes in the actual shape of your life, that might be useful information about what kind of change is actually needed now. The third thing is to find experiences that provide new evidence to the nervous system, not just thoughts about those experiences, the actual experiences, the relationship where you are genuinely known and it doesn't end badly, the moment of vulnerability that is met with real care, the situation where the old pattern would have activated and this time you stayed present and the feared thing didn't happen. These experiences don't come from insight. They come from being in situations, real situations with real people, and choosing responses different from the default ones. That's where the body learns, not from your excellent understanding of why it responds the way it does. I want to end with something honest. The idea that self-awareness is the primary tool of psychological health has been very useful and has helped a lot of people, but it's become, in some corners, a replacement for living, for acting, for making choices and taking risks and having the actual experiences that change things from the inside. You can become an expert on yourself and still live a small life, still avoid the things you know you need to do, still stay in situations that your insight tells you are wrong, still reach for the comfortable option rather than the real one. Understanding without action is just observation. An observation, however sophisticated, is not the same as a life. The most emotionally intelligent person I've ever encountered was not the most insightful. They were the most willing to feel what they felt, to act on what they found, to take the risk of actually changing the things that needed to change rather than endlessly analyzing why those things were the way they were. That's the version of emotional intelligence that actually changes things. Not the one that can explain your suffering with the most precision, the one that has the courage to do something about it, even without fully understanding it first, even when it's uncomfortable and uncertain and you're not sure you're ready. Especially then. Let me talk about something that doesn't usually come up in these conversations: the social performance of emotional intelligence. Because self-awareness has become a status symbol in certain circles. Something you demonstrate to signal that you're a thoughtful, developed, serious person. A way of showing that you've done the work that other people haven't. And when self-awareness becomes something you perform, when it becomes part of how you want to be seen, something shifts. It stops being purely a tool for genuine self-understanding and starts being partly a presentation you process out loud in ways designed to be impressive. You name your patterns with a fluency that signals sophistication. You discuss your wounds and your histories with an ease that communicates that you've integrated them, even if you haven't. Even if the fluency is a performance and the ease is practiced and the integration is more intellectual than actual, this is not a character flaw. It's what happens to any genuine capacity when it enters social environments that reward the performance of it. The capacity starts to serve two masters: genuine self-understanding and social presentation. And those two purposes are not always the same. The person performing emotional intelligence is not dishonest in any simple way. They've usually done real work. They have real insight. But there's a layer over it, a curated version of the insight that has been shaped for consumption. And underneath that layer is often the unprocessed, unperformed, genuinely messy stuff that the sophisticated vocabulary exists to manage. Genuine self-awareness doesn't care how it looks. It's often inarticulate, confused, in process. It doesn't have the clean narrative arc of the insight that gets shared in a podcast interview or a well-written Instagram caption. It's stumbling around in your own interior trying to see something that keeps moving. If your self-awareness is always neat enough to share, it might be worth asking what the unshareable version looks like. Here's something about pain that most emotionally intelligent people know intellectually, but haven't quite let land all the way. Not all suffering is a problem to be solved. Some of it is just what's true. When you love something and lose it, you suffer. Not because of a pattern, not because of old material being activated. Because loss is painful. Because the person is gone and they mattered to you, and that matters. When something you worked very hard for doesn't work out, there's grief in that. Not because of an underlying wound it triggered, just because it's hard. When you're exhausted after a genuinely exhausting period, the exhaustion is real. It doesn't always mean something. It doesn't always point somewhere. Sometimes it just means you've been doing hard things for a long time. Emotionally intelligent people sometimes have trouble with this because they've developed the habit of finding the signal in the feeling, of asking what the emotion is trying to tell them, what it points to, what it means. And sometimes feelings don't mean anything except what's immediately obvious. The grief means someone is gone. The exhaustion means you're depleted. The sadness means something sad happened. And the appropriate response to those feelings isn't insight. It's just allowing. Letting the grief be grief for what it is. Letting the exhaustion be a reason to rest, not material to analyze. There's a tendency, when you've trained yourself to find meaning in your experience, to need everything to be meaningful, to find it slightly uncomfortable when something is just what it is, without a deeper layer. But sometimes there isn't a deeper layer. Sometimes the surface is the whole thing. And being present to that, being willing to feel what you feel without immediately needing it to tell you something, is its own kind of intelligence. Let me talk about the body, because this is the most important thing I'll say in this video, and it's the thing that gets least attention. The conversations we have about emotional intelligence are almost entirely cognitive. They happen in language, in frameworks, in the processing of narrative and meaning. But suffering, most of the suffering that emotionally intelligent people experience, doesn't live in language. It lives in the body, in the tension that appears in certain situations before any conscious understanding has registered, in the way your breathing changes when a particular topic comes up, in the specific physical location of anxiety, the chest, the stomach, the throat, that you could map with precision because you know exactly where it goes when it arrives, in the exhaustion that appears in certain relationships before you've consciously decided you're tired, in the lightness that appears in others before you've consciously decided you're happy. The body is tracking everything, all the time, faster than consciousness, more honestly than language. And most emotionally intelligent people have a well-developed relationship with the cognitive part of their inner life and a relatively underdeveloped relationship with the bodily part. They can tell you what their patterns mean. They cannot always tell you what their body is doing right now. That gap between the sophisticated cognitive understanding and the direct bodily experience is often where the unresolved suffering lives, not in the narratives you haven't processed, in the sensations you haven't stayed with long enough for them to complete their cycle. Because emotions are physical events, not just cognitive ones. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end in the body. And when they get interrupted, when you shift into analysis before the physical experience has completed, they don't finish. They get stored. They wait. And the accumulation of interrupted emotional experiences is, in many people, what's underneath the persistent suffering that insight hasn't been able to reach. The way through is not more insight, it's more presence to the body, more willingness to feel what the body is feeling, to let it be there, in full, without managing it into something more cognitive, and to stay with it until it moves. This is uncomfortable. For people who've built identity around their capacity for insight, sitting in the body without making it mean something feels almost primitive. It isn't. It's actually more advanced than the insight, because it requires the thing that insight can help you prepare for but cannot replace: being present, fully present, in the experience, in the moment, in the body that is having it. That's where the suffering that understanding can't reach finally gets reached. I want to say something about the people in your life, because sometimes the suffering of emotionally intelligent people is partly about the people they're surrounded by. When you've done significant self-awareness work, when you understand your own patterns and can hold complexity and feel comfortable with nuance, it can create a gap between you and people who haven't done that work. Not because you're better, because you're speaking slightly different languages about the same things. You're at different points on the continuum, and navigating close relationships across that gap, trying to have the conversations that feel important to you with people who aren't equipped for them, trying to be understood in ways that the other person doesn't quite have the tools to understand. That's genuinely hard. It produces a specific loneliness. The loneliness of someone who can see clearly what's happening in a relationship and can't make the seeing shared, who can name the dynamic and can't make the naming land, who carries the understanding of what would help and can't transmit it to the person who needs to receive it. This loneliness is real. And it's not the same as the loneliness of someone who doesn't understand themselves. It has a different quality, more acute in some ways, because the understanding makes the gap more visible. If you felt this, I want to name it directly. It's not a sign that your self-awareness has made you difficult to be around. It's a sign that genuine intimacy requires two people who can be present to each other, and that's a rarer thing than either of them probably needs it to be. The answer isn't to lower yourself to the dynamic around you, but it might be to actively look for the people who can meet you where you are, to make the investment in finding the relationships that don't require you to translate yourself constantly. Because even the most self-aware person needs to be known. needs the experience of being genuinely met, not just generally appreciated. That experience of someone actually seeing you and responding to what they see is what the intellectual understanding of yourself cannot provide. Let me end with the most practical thing I can say. Self-awareness is a beginning, a necessary, valuable, irreplaceable beginning, but it's not the destination. The destination, if there is one, is a life that's actually being lived, that you're actually present in, where the understanding has become integrated enough that it's just how you move through the world, not something you apply consciously, step by step, theory by theory, just how you are. And getting from the beginning to the destination requires something more than continued insight. It requires experience. The messy, uncontrolled, sometimes painful, and sometimes wonderful experience of actually being in your life, in relationships, in work, in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of a day, making mistakes with the understanding you have, revising as you go, being wrong about yourself sometimes and updating, feeling things that you'd rather not feel and staying present to them anyway, living, not managing your life from a position of superior self-knowledge, living it from the inside. That's what the self-awareness was always in service of, not the understanding itself. The life that becomes more possible when the understanding is genuinely yours. Go live it. One last thing, because it matters. Progress in this doesn't look like suffering less. Not at first. It looks like being more present to the suffering, more honest about it, less managed. The same difficult feelings still come, but you're in them instead of observing them from a careful distance. You feel what you feel more completely, less filtered, less immediately converted into something more sophisticated. And gradually, not linearly, not dramatically, you make different choices more often. The pattern activates and you stay instead of flee. The old response comes up and you do something different. Not always, not perfectly, but more. That's the progress, not the absence of the suffering. A more honest, more present, more genuinely inhabited relationship to it. That's worth the work, and it's available to you right now. Not after more insight, not after you've understood yourself more completely. Now. In the next moment where a feeling arrives and you have the choice of analyzing it or staying in it. In the next situation where your pattern activates and you can notice that and choose differently. In the next conversation where you could either demonstrate your emotional intelligence or actually be emotionally present. That's where it happens, not in the understanding, in what you do with it every single time. That's the whole thing. That's it. Tell me in the comments. What's one thing you've understood about yourself for a long time that you haven't actually acted on yet? Not to confess, to name it, to make it real. Because naming what you're avoiding is the first step toward doing it. I'll see you in the next one.